Good morning and welcome to the Ways and Means Committee. Today is Tuesday, January 25, 2022. We have a fiscal briefing by the Department of Legislative Services. I'm Delegate Edith Patterson, sitting in for Chair Vanessa Atterbury and Vice Chair Alonzo Washington, who will be joining our briefing later. Chair Atterbury has provided statements, and they read a statement, and it reads as follows. We are fortunate to have a large state budget surplus. The surplus is largely due to a strong economy that has boosted tax revenues above expectations. We will decide this session how much to save, how much to spend, and how much to use for tax relief. We will keep in mind the long-term fiscal health of the state when making these decisions. The Department of Legislative Services will brief us on the governor's proposed budget, the long-term budget outlook, and major fiscal issues, including tax relief. I look forward to an informative briefing. And first, we'd like to thank David Romans and Teresa Tazinski, who are here from the Department of Legislative Services. David, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you and good morning. We have a document that I think is going to be shared on the screen with you to walk through. As was referenced in those opening remarks, this is truly the best of times in terms of state fiscal situation. Before the governor's budget was submitted, we had about a surplus of about $4 billion in the current year, which, as you'll see, he's proposed some uses of that money, and then I'll get into the details. So please go ahead and share the screen. If you're not going to be able to share the screen, hopefully the members actually have the document so that they're not just listening to us talk for a while. But I guess I will go ahead while we wait for the screen to get shared. In the big picture, the budget is about $58 billion. That includes state and federal dollars. It drops about $3.6 billion from last year. And the reason it drops is that federal funding was at an extremely high level in the current year because of all the federal stimulus money that came to Maryland, as well as enhanced Medicaid matching funds and some temporary enhancements to the SNAP program. So that money is starting to dissipate in the upcoming year. And that is why the overall budget drops. And federal funds are actually going to go down about 30%. The state general funds, which is what we usually focus on, is about $26 billion in the budget. It's a $4.6 billion increase, or 22%. It's a fairly historic general fund growth. I should note that a significant portion of that growth is an appropriation into the rainy day fund. So essentially appropriating money into a savings account. You take that out, the budget grows more like 13%. It is worth noting just on the federal funds that, as you know, Congress passed the federal infrastructure bill this past I guess a few months ago, and the money from that is not yet in the budget, in part because the federal agencies are still putting guidance out on how that money will be used. But that's about $2.8 billion of sort of new spending for Maryland. There's a lot of money that we already were sort of anticipating. It was just reauthorization of transportation funding, but quite a bit of new money that'll come in at some point, but it's not in the budget at the moment. If you're following along on our document, we're on page 2. It highlights the governor has a lot of tax relief in his budget proposal. He's proposing a reduction of about $224 million of revenues in fiscal 23, and that will grow to nearly $1 billion by fiscal 27. There's really 3 components of that tax relief. The first is phasing out the income tax on retirement income. As of last night, we had not seen the bill, so I can't really tell you the details of what that does, but it will be phased out completely by fiscal 28. So it's about a 6-year phase in. Business filing fees. The governor is waiving the filing fees for online filers. That will reduce revenues by about 36 million in the upcoming year and about 48 million by fiscal 27. And finally, extending the earned income tax credit enhancement. So last year in the Relief Act, you all proposed, or you actually enacted legislation that provided a temporary enhancement to the EITC for tax years 20 through 22. Here we go. So let's go on to the next page. That change would reduce revenue by about 164 million starting in fiscal 24. It already was ineffective for fiscal 23. Can we go to the next slide? All right, well, I'm on page 3, structural budget outlook. So one of the things we wanted to talk about as well, so is what the governor's proposing affordable? And in the governor's view, and the information he has released, it is. He would have a structural surplus, meaning ongoing revenues exceed ongoing spending by close to 200 to 300 million a year through fiscal 27, which is as far out as this forecast goes. Legislative Services thinks that the administration forecast is a little bit too optimistic about keeping K through 12 education costs down. We think a more appropriate estimate of K through 12 costs would lead to there actually being a structural deficit by fiscal 27 of about $400 million. So the governor's plan is affordable in the near term, but becomes a little bit less so by fiscal 27. And it'll actually get worse in fiscal 28 because that's when the tax relief is fully phased in. And it's when one of the things that's putting some pressure on general fund spending is the Kerwin implementation continues to ramp up over time. And by fiscal 28, a significant amount of general funds will be needed to supplement the Blueprint Fund, which you have created to largely support the Blueprint Fund. All right, to largely support the Kerwin implementation. Okay, I am on page 4 if anyone's following along. So the other issue we wanted to look at here is how is the governor's allocating the surplus? There's about a $4 billion surplus, as I mentioned, in the current year. And what did the governor do with that money? Well, in fact, he saved most of it. About 2.4 billion goes into the rainy day fund, which gives us a rainy day fund balance of $3.6 billion. That's 16% of general fund revenues. In addition to that, there's a general fund balance of almost $600 million, about 300 coming from this cash surplus. So the governor has socked away, billions of dollars of savings, over almost $4.2 billion. He also does do some spending with that surplus. The biggest chunk is about $900 million goes for general fund pay-go, which is sort of capital things funded with cash. So about a quarter of the surplus funding capital activities. And then there's a little over 300 million supporting sort of other one-time operating spending. Most notably, there were significant employee compensation increases in the current fiscal year, effective this month, actually, for almost every state employee. And so quite a bit of the money went toward that. I also wanted to highlight just some other key features of the budget for you. K through 12 education is growing by about 3.5%, about $260 million. It is important to note that there's one key component of Kerwin that was not funded by the governor. That's the education effort adjustment, which was supposed to help those jurisdictions that have to put a significant amount of money in to meet maintenance of effort, but also have relatively smaller tax bases. The governor is claiming this is not a mandate, although it certainly was intended to be a mandate. And so he left out $126 million. 99 million of that would have gone to Baltimore City, 26.5 million to Prince George's County. So those are the only two jurisdictions impacted by this. That's the money that he left out. The healthcare world, provider rate increases were mandated to go up 3.25% to 4%. This year, the governor funded all of those providers. That includes DDA providers, behavioral health, and many of the Medicaid community-based providers, as well as Medicaid nursing home providers. It's also a significant increase for physicians in the Medicaid program. There's quite a bit of money in the governor's budget for crime prevention and victim services. The most notable is nearly a $50 million increase to the police aid formula. This was a discretionary decision, and it allocates money to all of the big jurisdictions and as well as the rest of the state. About 6 to 8 million for each of the large jurisdictions, including Baltimore City, which does not normally benefit from the police aid formula. One other thing I would mention is childcare. The governor put 50 million of state funds in as a deficiency appropriation for the current year to help stabilize the childcare provider community. And then there's some additional money, about 10 million of enhanced funding in the upcoming budget year for childcare scholarships, which helps support low income children, to access childcare. The university system in Maryland is another area where the governor allocated a lot of money, almost a $300 million increase. That's about 19% in their state support. About 40% of that growth is for the salary increases that all state workers are receiving, but a substantial increase for them. Similarly, Morgan State University gets about a 28% increase for $33 million. And that also flows through to the other segments of higher education. The community college formula and the Selinger formula for the private institutions all run off of how much aid per student is provided to the public 4 years. So the community college formula is going to grow about $59 million, 19%. And the Selinger formula grows at almost 34%, or about $30 million. So substantial investments in the higher education arena. I've alluded a couple of times for employee compensation. Between the current year, providing some additional money effective this month, and then increases for salaries in fiscal 23, the governor is allocating about $832 million for employee compensation enhancements. And that's a combination of bonuses, COLAs, and increments, which are sort of similar to merit increases that most employees would receive. So on the operating budget, those are sort of the big highlights. I would just mention on capital, the governor's capital budget, when you combine general obligation bonds and cash that he's allocating, is about $2.3 billion. He's actually proposing about $265 million more in bonding authority than he proposed before session through his Capital Debt Affordability Committee. And of interest, I'm sure, to all of you, is that he actually set aside $50 million in the budget to be allocated by the House and Senate for legislative priorities. So in a departure from recent years, there's actually a substantial amount of money for legislative bond initiatives in the budget. The last thing I was going to talk about, and again, if you're following along on the document that hopefully you've received, the bottom of page 5 and then on to page 6, is just kind of the key considerations for the session, certainly the fiscal committees. One is obviously evaluating the governor's tax proposals, and whether you're comfortable with them, how you're going to proceed with those. The second is, there's this historic level of money in the rainy day fund. We've never been at 16% general fund revenues in the rainy day fund, 3.6 billion. So kind of evaluating whether that's the right amount. And if you think it is, perhaps putting some criteria into statute about when and how it should be used, as there's really no specific criteria on using the rainy day fund in the statute currently. The underfunding of Kerwin, as I mentioned, that big education effort adjustment that wasn't funded, the $126 million. There's also a bunch of small little sort of administrative programs related to Kerwin that were not mandates, but are in the statute, that the governor also did not fund, about $14 million, including things like training for the principals and other leaders, as well as for teachers, national board certification support, behavioral health training, a variety of, again, smaller programs, and they're outlined on page 6 of our document. Kind of providing some oversight on how that federal infrastructure money is going to be used by the executive branch, I think is going to be an issue. And then I think one other issue that might be of interest to this committee is the Blueprint Fund. So based on the governor's budget proposal, we think the Blueprint Fund can support all of the Kerwin implementation costs through fiscal 25, and it can cover most of those costs in fiscal 26. But in fiscal 27, the costs that the governor intends to allocate to the Blueprint Fund would exceed the amount of revenue going into the Blueprint Fund. So a general fund supplement would be needed. And general fund supplement will grow in subsequent years as we continue to roll out the Kerwin implementation plan through fiscal 2034. So whether you want to shore up the Blueprint Fund by putting some additional funding in there to help make sure those out-year costs is funded is certainly an issue to consider. And the last issue I would just mention, this is probably more of an issue in appropriations, is right now about more than 10% of state jobs are vacant. And I think we all have heard about the difficulty everybody has hiring right now. In some areas of state government, we've had trouble hiring for many years in the corrections area, in the state hospitals, hiring nurses, due to salary and other factors. But now we're seeing it pretty much across the board. Almost every major agency in state government has over 10% vacancies. So the governor has clearly tried to address this with the salary enhancements that I have referenced. And I think the question becomes, is that enough? Are there other things, other creative things the state should be doing in terms of recruitment and retention and trying to make state employment more attractive, especially in such a competitive employment environment right now? So that was my sort of big picture overview of the budget. As I said, Teresa Chizinski is here to give you a couple of talking points on revenues and the economy. But if you have some questions on the budget, I'm happy to answer them. I hope you all have at least the document, since we haven't been able to share it on the screen apparently, so that you can kind of see in more detail what we're talking about.
Hi, committee. I am back. The vice chair is back too. We had to hop over to rules. So I want to thank Delegate Patterson for taking the reins in my absence. Thank you very much, Delegate. There are two questions. I do see the vice chair and Delegate Ebersol, but let's get through both presentations. And we do apologize. There is some low bandwidth problems happening right now in the Ways and Means Committee, so the screens can't be shared, but everyone did receive the documents, and OIS is with Sarah and Haley now trying to work it out. So it might get fixed, it might not, but that's the situation. So we'll go ahead with the next part of the presentation and then do questions altogether.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to start talking from page 7. I'm going to cover page 7 and page 8 if you have the document in front of you. Page 7 is about the Maryland economy. So we just provide you the performance of some key metrics for the Maryland economy for the prior calendar year 2021 by month. And we're going to start with the labor market. The first couple of columns relate to the labor market. And the way to understand the chart, like the first column is just the percent change in employment. So the January number is the change between January 21 over January 2020. You can see the first 3 months of January of 2021 were actually all negative unemployment. And that's because we were comparing to the period in 2020 before the pandemic had really begun. And then the next couple months, April, May, and June, all have very strong growth. And that's because you're comparing to the period in 2020 when the pandemic had first begun and where we saw the most severe impact on the economy of the pandemic recession. So it's just a good reminder that when you see percent changes and year-over-year percent changes with any economic statistic, you have to keep in mind that sometimes it's telling you more about what happened in the prior year than in the current year. The second column is the difference over January 2020. So this is just the total number of jobs today in each of these months relative to the pre-pandemic peak, which was in January 2020. Between January and April of 2020, the state lost about 400,000 jobs, which was a little over 14%. As of November, which is the latest data we have, we're still down a little less than 85,000 jobs, which is a little over 3%. Now, of course, one of the sectors that was hardest hit by the pandemic was, of course, the industry that includes hotels and motels, restaurants and bars. That industry lost about half their jobs between January and April of 2020, about 122,000 jobs in the state. And as of November, they were still down a little less than 40,000 jobs, about almost 17%. So they account for a little bit less than half of the current jobs gap of 85,000. Another sector that is contributing to that gap is the healthcare and social assistance. That sector is still down about 13,000 jobs, 3.5%. It includes everything you think of as healthcare, as well as nursing homes. It also includes things like childcare providers. But there are a couple industries that are actually higher now in terms of employment than they were before the pandemic started in January 2020. The biggest percentage-wise is the transportation utilities sector, which is up 7.5%, about 8,200 jobs. And this is really being driven by the subsector of that industry that includes warehousing, as well as courier and delivery services. So it's not surprising, given the huge increase in online sales, that those industries are adding employment. Another sector that's up is actually the federal government. The federal government is up 6,300 jobs, about 4.3% over that January 2020 timeframe. And the federal government was actually the only industry that did not lose jobs over the course of the pandemic recession. And then the other one that's up is the professional services sector. It's up about 11,000 jobs, it's about 4%. This is a broad sector that includes things like law firms, architectural firms, accounting, management consulting companies, research and development, computer services. It's a sector that includes a lot of federal contractors, a lot of white collar professionals who, of course, were able to work remotely during the pandemic. Those last two sectors, the federal government and professional services, they're some of the highest paying sectors in our economy. And that feeds into strong wage growth. So on page 7, towards the middle, you can see the growth in wages. Wage data is only available on a quarterly basis, which is why you only see it every couple of months. So March is the first quarter, June is the second quarter, November is the third quarter, and that's the latest available data. You can see year to date through September, wages are up 8.4% in 2021. And some of this is about how weak 2020 was, especially the second quarter, that 10.9% increase. In the second quarter of 2020, aggregate wages in Maryland fell 2.4%. But it's also being driven by both the job growth and especially the job growth in those higher paying industries. But of course, we know inflation has been elevated. And so the second column related to wages on page 7 adjusts for inflation. And that obviously comes down quite a bit, but it's still positive in the low single digits. And if you're interested in inflation, I did include at the bottom of this table a little table that shows you the couple of years of history for the U.S. Consumer Price Index, 19, 20, and 21, and then the forecast over the next couple of years. The state contracts with two private economic forecasting companies, Moody's Analytics and IHS Markit, and this is their respective forecasts for the U.S. Consumer Price Index. This is their forecast from this month, January. You can see they both forecast inflation to remain sort of in the 4 to 5% range in calendar 2022, and then it comes down to a little over 2% going forward. This is consistent with the Federal Reserve's inflation targets. The Federal Reserve, of course, is going to begin tightening monetary policy very, very soon. The other big story in the economy in 2021 was the housing market. And the last two columns on page 7 deal with the housing market in Maryland. It's the year-over-year percent change for existing home sales and the median home price for existing homes. This is data from the Maryland Association of Realtors, and the most recent data is from the month of November that I have on the chart you can see. You can see in the first half of 2020, very, very strong home sales growth, as well as strong price growth. But again, this tells you a little bit more about 2020, because in the first part of 2020, when the pandemic began, there was a really sharp drop in home sales. But the interesting that happened in 2020 was in the second half of the year, home sales actually started to grow very strongly, in part due to low mortgage rates. And in fact, for the entire year of 2020, home sales in the state were up 9.3%, and the median price was up about 9%. So you'll notice that in the second half of 2021, home sales have actually started to fall on a year-over-year basis. Although I will say they're well above 2019 levels, in part because mortgage rates are lower now than they were pre-pandemic still. And then, of course, the median home price has continued to rise. Despite the recent decline in sales, home prices have continued to rise on a year-over-year basis. This is helped by not only strong demand, but there's been just very, very low inventory of homes for sale. And that's helping to push up prices as well. If we turn now to page 8 and look at the revenues, The next chart shows you the general fund revenue forecast from the Board of Revenue Estimates. This compares their estimate that came out in December last month to their previous forecast, which was done in September. And you can see in total, general fund revenues were revised up by $495 million. That's about a 2.3% upward revision. Fiscal 23 was revised up by $543 million. That's about a 2.4% upward revision. The bulk of the revision is coming from the personal income tax and the sales tax, our two largest revenue sources for the general fund. Between September and December, the BRE did slightly revise up their economic forecast as measured by Maryland personal income and wage income in both calendar 21 and calendar 22. I will say that the economic forecast that underlies the December BRE estimate was done in about mid-November. So it was not only pre the Omicron wave, it was before anybody had even heard of Omicron. So that's something to keep in mind. The Board of Revenue Estimates will review the forecast, and they may or may not issue a new forecast in March. In the context of doing that, they will look at new economic forecasts from those consultants next month. But regardless, given just sticking with the December estimate, that stronger wage growth does result in an upward revision to the income tax directly through withholding. Withholding is by far the biggest component of the personal income tax. We are also, between September and December, got past the final due date for tax year 2020 income tax returns, and those final payments with those returns were stronger than anticipated. There was also a technical factor that contributed materially to the upward revision. In September, the BRE had overestimated refunds. They had double counted some of the tax year 20 refunds that had been paid to date. A substantial portion, about $240 million, was double counted. And so if you overestimate refunds, you underestimate the general fund. And so in correcting that mistake in December, that also contributed to the upward revision of the income tax. And the other big upward revision, of course, was the sales tax. You can see up $226 million in 22, $223 million in 23. This is due to the revised economic forecast as well as strong year-to-date revenues. But there's also an issue with the blueprint fund that's worth highlighting at the bottom of the table here on page 8. As you will recall, the sales tax is shared with the blueprint fund in a very specific way. There are certain sources of revenue that are shared with the blueprint fund. There's actually 3 different categories. There are revenues from remote sellers who were required to collect the sales tax after the Supreme Court Wayfair decision. This is basically remote sellers who do not have any sort of physical presence in the state. They don't have a store, they don't have a warehouse, they don't have anything. The other category is revenues collected by marketplace facilitators on third-party sales through their site. So think of a company like Amazon, where a lot of third parties sell through their site. Previous to legislation, which was passed at the 2019 session, Amazon would collect the sales tax on their own sales, but they would not collect the sales tax on third-party sales unless the third party asked them to. Now they are required to do so. Those 2 categories together, the first $100 million goes to the general fund and the rest goes to the blueprint. And then the third category are revenues from digital goods, all of which goes to the blueprint. So think of streaming services, for example, or digital downloads. This was legislation that was passed at the 2020 session. The governor vetoed it, and the veto was overridden at the 2021 session. So it's important to keep in mind that finding those revenues, identifying the revenue in the sales tax that should be shared with the blueprint is not straightforward, unfortunately. It doesn't just pop out of the controller's processing of sales tax revenues. The Controller's Office has changed their sales tax form. They asked the vendors to identify whether or not they belong in one of these categories. But the BRE has discovered that you really can't rely on the self-reporting of taxpayers. And so they have to manually go through tax returns to identify the revenue that should be shared with the blueprint fund. And this is a time-consuming process, and you need to have access to the tax returns to do it. At the closeout for fiscal 2021, last September, the Controller's Office was aware that they had underdistributed to the blueprint fund, in part because they did not have access to not all of the sales tax returns were in their processing system. They had the cash, they had the money, but they didn't have access to all the returns. And so they could not determine exactly how much should be shared with the blueprint, but they were aware that they had underdistributed. The plan was to do an extra distribution in fiscal 22 to make up for that. At the time of the September estimate, this was estimated to be $88 million. So if you give $88 million extra to the blueprint in 2022, that means the general fund gets $88 million less. Subsequent to September, the BRE had the chance to go through all of the sales tax returns for fiscal 21, and they determined that the underdistribution was less than expected. It was $49 million. You can see that revision here on page 8. And so in 2022, the Comptroller's Office is going to make a $49 million extra distribution to the blueprint fund. But this does lower the blueprint in fiscal 22, and it raises the general fund estimate in fiscal 22. And it also has an impact on sort of our baseline assumption about general fund revenues in the sales tax versus blueprint revenues, because one gets higher and one gets lower. So it actually has sort of a double impact in fiscal 22 and an ongoing impact in fiscal 23. So that is kind of complicated, but it's worth pointing out because it was material, and hopefully going forward, we don't continue to have that problem. I will say the Comptroller's Office continues to struggle with identifying how much sales tax revenue should go to the blueprint fund. And we're sitting here halfway through fiscal 22, and we don't have any information on that yet. So, but anyway, I will stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions about either the economy or the revenues.
Can you all hear me? Okay, so I see 2 questions, Vice Chair and then Delegate Ebersol.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you guys for this great presentation. And Madam Chair, thanks for scheduling this for us to be able to get this briefing. Thank you for that. Just a question about the blueprint. I have a few questions actually, but let's start with the blueprint and the underfunding of Prince George's and Baltimore City. Wanted to know, you put on your list of items that what we can do to change legislatively, or what we can do. Can you just tell us what can happen to make sure that $125 million is placed back into the budget and funding Prince George's and Baltimore City?
Well, the first thing that's happening is the Attorney General's office is evaluating whether or not it really is a mandate. The administration is claiming for this year it is not. Certainly the legislative intent was the otherwise. So I think the best case scenario is the AG says, yes, it's a mandate, and the administration puts a supplemental budget in, adding the money in to comply with the statute. If it's decided it's not a mandate, then it would be a negotiation to get the governor to add the money into the budget through a supplemental sort of on his own accord later in session.
Do you know when we'll hear back from the Attorney General, or is there a timeline for that at all?
There's not a specific timeline. I think they recognize that this is obviously an important issue and question for the General Assembly.
Yeah, and just for folks who are new to the committee, I mean, this is something that the General Assembly felt that it was necessary because Prince George's and Baltimore City have a high need and a low tax base to be able to make sure that they are funding the Blueprint for Maryland's Future and their responsibilities. So this is a really important piece that we have to get right this session and work with the governor or whomever to make sure that this is fully funded. So it's really important. I do want to change gears to something that we don't talk about here a lot in Ways and Means, which is the federal infrastructure bill. And I wondered if that funding that's coming in, we've had some issues with the federal bill. It said something in law that it could fund things like the magnetic levitation train. And I wondered if that was taken out of this bill, or if it's still part of it that could be funded through the funding from the federal government. And then my other piece of that question for the infrastructure bill, did the governor or anyone did the governor include additional funding to boost the construction for the Purple Line? Obviously, that has been delayed for multiple years now, and our community, specifically mine, is sitting in construction. And I know Delegate Wilkins feels the same way. And so we're wondering, like, when is this funded fully this year in the budget, or do we need to make changes here in the General Assembly?
I don't have all the details on the Purple Line. I understand that there is money in the budget to proceed with the project just on the delayed timeline because of all the delays. So I don't believe there's any intentional underfunding going forward. My understanding is, yeah, that the magnetic transit option you can't use the infrastructure money for that.
I love that answer. Thank you.
Delegate Ebersol, and then I see Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to echo all the thank yous that the Vice Chair threw at the beginning of his question there. Thanks to everyone for setting this up. In the area that I pay attention to, I see that on page 4, we have $50 million set aside for childcare providers. And then later on in the graph, it shows up again. Is this strict? Do you understand? Is this broken down at all? Is it for providers, or is it also for scholarships and that sort of thing? Was it detailed at all, or did it just say $50 million for childcare providers and it would fall to MSDE, or what agency would then administer that? Do you have any idea?
Yes, so the 50 million is in for the current year. It's a kind of a deficiency for the current year. It is for stabilization grants to the childcare providers, which is on top of the hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money that is also available for stabilization grants to the providers. And just like the federal money, the State Department of Education is responsible for allocating out those grants to the providers. Now, in addition to that 50 million, there's $10 million of sort of in growth in fiscal 23's budget for the Child Care Scholarship Program to help support more low-income families.
And is that additional 10%, does that just meet the current requirements and we're looking at more students, or is that really to offer for the ability to offer scholarships at a higher level of income and that sort of thing?
I think it is. I understand that they're just expecting demand to go up. Obviously, demand's been a little bit lower with the pandemic and people, childcare providers being closed and people staying home, but they're expecting the demand to return, and this supports an increase in demand.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for this presentation. Both of them were just very useful, so thank you for breaking it down for us. I wanted to better understand the general fund surplus and wanted to get a sense of the surplus funds. Do those include the federal stimulus, all the federal money that has been coming in? And can you just further break down for us just how we have come about the surplus in a little bit more detail? And then I think I have a follow-up question after that.
Sure. So the surplus is all just state dollars, state general fund dollars. So it does not include any of the federal stimulus money. Now, obviously, the economy, the reason we have all this cash is that the revenue estimates in both fiscal 21 and again in 22 have beaten the original estimates by a great deal. And part of that is because they were very conservative estimates as the pandemic began. Everyone was very cautious about revenue estimates, and things have gone much better in terms of the overall economy. And certainly all that federal stimulus certainly helped support our economy, which so it kind of indirectly contributes to the surplus. But all the surplus is state dollars, that $4 billion that we kind of entered the session with for the current year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's something that's helpful. So my other question relates to the infrastructure funds that are coming in. I just wanted to get a sense of, are we anticipating that for those funds, they will be very specific from the federal government for very specific projects? Or do you anticipate that we'll have a little bit of room to working with the next governor to sort of move funds around? Will it be kind of fungible, or will it be for very specific outline projects?
Sure. So if you happen to have the document, page 18 of the document provides a little bit of information on the infrastructure money. And so overall, it provides about $8 billion to the state, and they come in buckets. So there's money for highways, there's money for transit, there's money for the port. There's quite a bit of money for clean water, including replacing lead pipes throughout the state. There's over 200 million for that purpose. There's quite a bit of money for broadband. So it is targeted to certain policy areas, if you will. And then within those buckets, like within transportation, there's a pot for highways and there's a pot for transit, and it can only be used for those purposes. And then further complicating things is there's some of the money is just grants to the state, and the state has flexibility within that policy area, whether it's transit or highway, to use it how it wants. Other parts of it are going to be competitive nationally. So you have to make a specific proposal on what you're going to do with it. So there's not a simple answer to that question, but it does sort of cover the broad areas shown on page 18. And as I said, there's 8.2 billion total. A lot of the transportation money, it was reauthorization of existing funding streams that MDOT was already anticipating would ultimately be reauthorized. So in terms of like truly new dollars, it's more like 2.8 billion of new money that the state wasn't sort of already anticipating receiving. And that's broken out in the bottom part of that chart on page 18. You can see more than half of it goes to transportation and most of the rest to water-related programs.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Delegate Barnes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, David, for the presentation. I heard you speak in regards to the amount of money put in for higher education with the University of Maryland system, as well as our community colleges. But I did not hear anything in regards to our 4 HBCUs here in Maryland. Can you expound on that?
Sure. The one I know off the top of my head is Morgan State University is getting a 33 million increase, which is a 28% increase. It's bigger than the university system growth, which is about 19%. And the major reason for that is the money includes the first round of payments from the HBCU settlement with the state. So that money is starting to flow to the schools. I can get you the money for the institutions within the university system. I can say all of the HBCUs grow at a faster rate than the other institutions, again, in part because some of those settlement monies are starting to flow to the schools.
Right, so the increase that the 4 HBCUs are receiving is separate and apart from the settlement that was agreed upon, is that correct?
The institutions are both getting a significant increase just because the state is increasing money for all the schools. And then on top of that, they're also getting the HBCU settlement money.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that the settlement is not tied into what should be an automatic increase into their annual budget.
I'll send you the details on what the institutions are getting so you can see how it's working out.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. I do want to mention that to the public who is listening, the documents, they did eventually, OIS fix some of the technical issues, but they were posted on the website when the hearing was posted so that you have access to that as well. Committee members, I will see you at 1 p.m. We just have 3 bills, so I'll see you.